We want to send a special thank you to Bailey Pottery Equipment and Ceramics Supply for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. At Bailey, you get the very best products along with extensive product information and excellent prices. In every line of equipment, you'll find functional features that teachers and professional potters have come to depend on. At the Bray, our Bailey gas kilns are the preferred choice among artists who create large work because they're easy to fire and very reliable. If you want to go big, go Bailey. For more information, visit baileypottery.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 412 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I welcome Sunshine Cobb back to talk about her new book, The Beginner's Guide to Hand Building. In our interview, we talk about creating a studio environment that fits your personality, as well as the variety of skills and projects that she teaches in the text. The book is available now for pre-order and will be released in September of this year. You can find out more information about that at sunshinecobb.com. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to thank the folks that have donated to our show. Specifically, I wanted to thank Maya Ladismaki, John Britt, and Lucy Alexander for their recent contributions. I couldn't make the show without the generosity of folks like those, so if you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do so at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Yeah, so I thought we'd start talking about creativity itself. In your book, you talk about how students often will tell themselves, like, I'm not creative. You might be creative, but I'm not creative. And you had the simplest thing. You said, well, why don't you just redefine creativity to include yourself? So can you talk about that, like how you've observed that in students and what the solution for that is?
Well, it's so funny because I think, I draw a lot of experience from my workshop days, basically teaching workshops and being around students. And one of the populations, my favorite population to teach are kind of people coming back to their creativity after having sort of set it down to raise a family or have a job or whatever reason they sort of had to put aside creativity or following some sort of creative path. And, and what I hear from them most of the time is that, oh, I'm not creative. And it's kind of, I think, what people tell themselves. I think there's lots of reasons why we don't believe we're creative. And I think for myself, it's always been this creativity is just problem solving. That's always how I've seen it. And so that it's really important to just look at it that way, that it's all these sort of small baby steps towards finding what kind of ignites your passion and that creativity in you. But really, it's just the baby step of like, oh, I just need to solve this problem. I need a soap dish, or I need whatever that thing is. Because I think a lot of times we can make it a very big problem. Like I need to create a masterpiece. I need to have I even sort of had that happen in the book where I wanted to make a like Calder-esque mobile. And I was like, okay, I've never made an actual mobile, so maybe I should need to scale it down, because so I think we even as makers can run into the kind of an exaggerated brilliance. Like we want to have this brilliant moment that our first idea is our best idea or will be our last idea. And I've run into that a lot too, where people, they put off working on an idea because they believe it's going to be their last idea or their last best idea, when it's actually not that great of an idea usually to begin. Like whenever we have an idea, you jump into it and you're like, huh, that does not work the way I thought it was going to work. You run into that. And so for me in this book, it was kind of like, for me, it's one of the things that I really connect to and really is a joy in my making practice or in my teaching practice more is that is connecting people to their creativity, and that to like redefine the stories that we tell ourselves about our creativity, our ability. Because I think sometimes those stories can happen really young when we're, you do a drawing and nobody likes it the way that you like it. Or, I remember I used to write poetry and nobody understood it. And so it really turned me off to writing poetry because I just wanted to be understood in some really deep, meaningful way. But I couldn't make that happen. And so sometimes, it's like looking at why we're creative. Is it for other people or is it for ourselves? And like, I think during COVID times where this sort of book project was born, it was like, well, what's going to keep me sane? What's going to keep me going? How do I fill my day? How do I quiet the racing in my brain? And so I think that, to me is a lot about getting my hands busy. And once I get my hands busy, the rest, the brain starts to quiet and follow, like it follows what I'm doing. And then I can make decisions on that. And so, that's kind of a crazy broad definition of what I think creative, but I think it is like, I just believe that creativity and connecting to like a creative practice is a fundamental experience as a human. And we've kind of lost access to that. A lot during COVID, especially, people lost access to their buildings, but people even before then, like, we have a tendency, at least coming from an university background, there was kind of an elitism that's sort of attached to creativity and kind of artistic ability, that through 20 years of teaching, I kind of don't feel that way anymore. Like, I just am like, no, it's really important for everybody to connect to a creative self, a creative practice, to dive into, because I think that's the thing. It's like a representation of our thoughts and our experiences and our morals and how we maybe want the world to be or how we view the world in the moment, so.
Yeah. And I think with creativity, people, the more they like a topic, the more they're willing to risk the failure that's necessary part of the creativity. And so sometimes when I hear people say I'm not creative, I don't say this in the workshop because they're obviously taking a workshop from me. Yeah. But I think like maybe clay's not the thing. Like maybe painting is the thing, or cooking. Like people connect to creativity in cooking because there's so little sort of risk involved. Like you have one bad meal, that's okay. So I think some part of the workshop experience and other teaching is like, how can we get the student to feel like it's just today? Like we're just making things together today. We're not, like you said, we're not making any masterpieces.
Right. Well, I think it has to do with vulnerability, right? Especially in a workshop scenario, we're worried about what people will see, how they're going to react to it, what they're going to say. And I think we, critiques and that, I hate critiques. I've always hated critiques, and in part because I don't quite, I understand the idea that you're supposed to like grow from them, but they've always been like Christmas to me, where I always get the wrong gift, right? I'm always like, if I want this one thing, I get the opposite, and that's not what I wanted. And so I think there's sometimes that feeling to me of, because I'm also not a proponent of everybody clapping for everybody in a workshop. Like I don't like that either, or excuse me, during a critique. But because I think there is this, what I view as an important part of that is that, I don't know, it's such a funny thing because I think there is, I want to say like a miscommunication of what constructive criticism is these days. And, I think so many people are disconnected from their creativity that it's really easy to kill that with just a few words. And so I think it is, and I think that's one of the things that, in a positive light of like COVID times, of like, if you're just working at your kitchen table, nobody cares. But that's also maybe not true, because maybe your partner doesn't like what you're doing and you're making it like there's always criticism, right? And that I think we can be our most vicious critic. Our internal voice can really shut us down. But I also think that interesting thing of like taking that time, making that time, setting aside that time for ourselves. We're so like the buzzwords of like self-care these days. Part of this is a self-care thing, but that it's a very really vulnerable situation because there's a lot of ways that you personally can attack yourself or be attacked kind of from an outside world. And it's part of that. It's trying to create that safe space for folks, so.
Yeah, and I think culturally sometimes we get the idea that self-criticism will lead to a better self, and I don't know if that's true. Like I in my own journey have had to just extinguish self-talk altogether.
Yeah.
Because it's a trap, It's like, am I going to talk bad to myself for 5 minutes and then do 5 minutes of affirmations? Like you could do that, but I have not found that effective.
No.
Like I've found it better to just like try to minimize self-talk as much as possible. But as you said, get engaged through the process of making. Let the making guide my mind, not let my mind guide the making, if that makes sense.
For sure.
So you mentioned that this book came about in COVID because, we were all isolated. There was this sense of like, oh my God, we're alone. And I know that you wrote the book during that time, but I think the book is also for people that might be working on their own. It is a beginner's guide. So can you talk about how this idea of working alone or being alone shaped the book, both for you and for the potential reader?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is that, I don't know about you. I mean, it's one of those funny things as a maker or self-employed person, but also like a studio potter, spend a lot of time alone. And I think a lot of this comes from my own personal experience and journey in that it is, like I used to just rail against that. It was really hard. And I think during COVID, I learned to embrace that because I was safe. Like I had the ability to work and keep doing what I was doing. And I just had to stay in my lane. And really have learned now just what a blessing that is. And even, so I think what happened with the book and that idea is that, because I also think what's come out during COVID and all that sort of stuff is that, and I don't know about for you, because you also wrote a wheel book, back in the day, like from that experience also was so many people reaching out and expressing gratitude that, I was their teacher sitting at their kitchen table. That was the studio they had access to. And so I think I was able to embrace that a lot more for this project because I was in lockdown, because I had just space and time, and was really re-examining creative lifestyles, but also what are the essentials that you need to have a creative practice, right? It didn't even have to be necessarily clay, but because what's funny is like during COVID, I didn't do a lot of clay work because I taught and I did other things, but I did a lot of sewing. For me, it was really comforting to put pieces together. Like it was like, okay, this has a formula. I just follow the pattern and this is what I do. Like, because I also had a ton of inventory from canceled shows. Like I just didn't need any more ceramic work. And so for me, finding some avenue to be creative that also was comforting was really important. And so, and that's kind of what I wanted this book to be, was that like, kind of you can sit down and finish up at least one step and then put it aside and then come back to it. Like that could be done in a really kind of piecemeal sort of way. That it didn't involve you having to go to the studio and be there for 8 hours at a time, because I think that is something that is a privilege and also not necessarily as accessible to a lot of people's lifestyles, right? And that shouldn't deny them being able to have a creative practice. And so for me, this was about making a lot of these tiny little projects that, have steps that maybe you wait in between, but, I can do this in 20 minutes and figure it out and then do another thing, so. I don't know if that you ask a question and then I am tangentially like going in a direction.
I love the tangents, and from us hanging out that we can go on tangents together for the next hour in whatever direction you want. There are some things in the book that you made as a part of the projects, like you mentioned the mobile project. which is based off of kind of Calder's mobiles, but they're made with ceramic. And so you would be making little parts and then suspending them together so that they move in space. Like that's something you mentioned you'd never done. There were some animal projects that I've never seen you sculpt animals. Like there's all these like new things that you challenged yourself to do as a part of the teaching process of this book. So can you talk about getting outside of your comfort zone in terms of like which projects you were going to pick?
Well, it's that idea of like to me, the basic idea of a beginner guide. I mean, that's a funny thing too about publishing. Or publishing a book. Nowadays, it's kind of a project oriented. They want a project book. And so that is kind of where I started, was like, I'm just going to make a list of things that are kind of not ubiquitous or popular, kind of in the ceramic lexicon of late, and I think, and they're also like things that I have in my own, early on in my own personal practice, I would like kind of poo-poo. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so I really wanted to confront that in myself, and also challenge myself to these kind of, because I think that's part of, sometimes as somebody that's worked in this field for 20 some odd years, you lose touch with the idea of being a beginner or learning, like that you're learning a new skill. And so some of these projects are like, okay, how would I go about doing this? And on some of them, I wrote the project before I actually made the object. And I was like, okay, and then I have to go back and be like, oh no, that doesn't work. So I got to go back and fix the text. Like I really kind of muddled through, kind of in the same way that I would in making an object. And so because I also like, I wanted this book and the projects to be appealing to everybody, to like, that if I wanted to teach a group of kids a project, that, because like I talked about in the mobile project, I thought about doing like dinosaur cutouts with like cookie cutters, because I was like, oh, my little nephew's into dinosaurs right now. And so like that idea that this is only a starting point, and that can be really versatile to what our actual interests are, like it could be used. And so I think that was really what spoke to me in the moment was, and also I felt like I had a lot more time in a weird way. Like the first book I felt really rushed, and that first book I felt really kind of insecure about my writing, about how people would take what I was saying. I didn't feel the mastery word very much. It was really hard for me to get behind that title. But it was like part of the series. And so this book, I feel like, strangely, I'm way more comfortable myself. I really don't care what the ceramics community or the ceramic academic community thinks about what I do, because to me, this is about everyday folks that want to kind of pick up a hobby, or, kind of find something that speaks to them. Because, I mean, anytime you find a medium that connects with you, it's very kind of visceral, and that's clay for me, right? And I think that can be clay for a lot of people. And so, I just wanted that to be accessible, and that idea that you could, if you wanted to, you could teach your kids how to make clouds or a fox, or, like, to me, that was all that spirit animal kind of talk, the little animals, like, I had so much fun making those, and I actually had never made them before, but it was so much fun, and there was so much joy. And I think that sometimes we can, especially if you're in this as your career, you can lose a little bit of that joy, and you're just making. And for me, it was this sort of chance to challenge myself, and that challenging, I think, really helped me get kind of personal with the message of the book in some fashion, or like just in these little bits, because it's really broken up into little bits.
The broader context of the book is there's a sculptural part and then there's a functional part. And in the functional part, there are some pots of yours that I've seen you make before. But then when you were showing the diagrams of how you made them, like as a potter, I was like, that's how she makes that. So there's like the candelabra. I learned so much from watching sort of the simplicity and complexity both of that, So can you talk about making a complex form, but simplifying it for potentially a beginner or anyone that might be reading the book?
It's so funny because I just had a conversation recently with a friend, and I am a jump in the deep end kind of person. Like, okay, I'm just gonna do this. And then I'm like, oh well, didn't quite work. So often I get way ahead of myself in the sort of making process and have maybe a sketch or a thought, and then I have to backtrack. And so a lot of times I'll come up with an idea, and then I kind of have to reverse engineer that idea. And but I also am like, I like to be straightforward. I like things to be really clear in their path, and like, okay, well, you just make a slab and you stick another slab to it, and then you do this, and it's like, oh really? That doesn't seem like right, and so and I think it is funny because I think that's part of my kind of get it done attitude, but also like there is a like the quickest path is from A to B, and so that's really, but it's also like I think there are these like the distractions or tangents, you want to say, like decorating that. Okay, like originally, however that candelabra kind of works out, it's like, well, yeah, but oh, if I because I always want to poke holes in things or figure out, okay, how do we? Because I think that's part of like using an object and the form as foundation to then build upon. I think that's also like the message of the book. I want people to see these as a starting point for their own ideas.
You did the simplest thing with the candelabra. I want to describe it a little bit. It's a half moon that there's then piercings cut out of the half moon. That's the vertical base. And then there's a horizontal piece that wraps over the top. And when I first looked, and I've looked at your pots before, and I've thought, does she put the slab on top? But you just took the half moon, turned it upside down, and put that on the slab that's resting on the table. And I was like, why have I not thought of this? Like, it's not only the simplest way to do it, but it's the most fresh way to do it. And that's one of the things I love about your pots in general, is that you touch it enough, but you don't overtouch. So I felt that was really interesting just to see that like simple thing. Like, no, just do it the other way around.
Right. Well, I also am not a very coordinated person sometimes. I mean, you've worked out with me. I'm a little bit all over the place, right? So to me, it is that like, okay, if I do it this way, I'm going to have trouble like holding everything in place. And so what makes more sense to stability, right? I'm always kind of like, okay, especially with clay, like a lot of this book has a lot of these sort of medium to hard slabs. Like it's really a different way for me to work, but also like, how do I find the most like yeah, because you're right, it's like sometimes it is about touch, but it is also just about like, it is, to me it's like 100% about stability and how many hands I actually have. So it's just like, what's real? I can't like get my foot up there to hold it too, so I need to like and I'm always so bad about like, oh, I'll use my water bottle, and it's like, no, I can't, I gotta keep it simple, so um and that's the thing, it's like even that project, it's like I played around with making it solid and then cutting it, like, or making it whole, like without any piercings, and then went back and I was like, oh, if I pierce it before, that's a little bit easy. Like I can be more clear and more like, I come back to the word stable, but like it's more like there's just a little bit more, oh, okay, when is the right time to work with, to do certain things with clay, right? I think that sometimes it always comes back to like, when's the right moment to do this thing? And so now's the right moment to do that. Then I can, so part of it is like, because I also hate I mean, it's so funny coming up with templates and everything's like my least favorite thing in the world to do. But it also like, it's like, because it's all involves measuring, and I'm always, I measure eyebally kind of, how would you say, I guesstimate. Like a lot of times I don't have my ruler. I mean, I have a ruler, but I'm like, even like recently I've been making all this kind of new work, and I have to kind of write down like, okay, my plates are, I cut it off at 1.5 inches, and then the next time I'm like, I have to write it down because I'm like, oh, I think I cut it off at 2 inches last time. It's like, oh no, that's now big. Like, so I really do have to take notes and to be able to develop that consistency. So it's same with like the candelabra form, like kind of inspired by kind of dinner table life, like sitting at a dinner table and being able to see over something. And but also that idea of like just beauty, like the way light plays through an object. That's always kind of, it's an interesting thing.
At this one point, you told this wonderful story about being in Spain and eating in a restaurant and having tapas brought out to
Yeah.
you, and how that inspired these plates. But I want you to tell that story. But then also the challenge you give the reader is, how do you make a plate that holds emotion? So first, can you tell that story and then talk about the
Sure.
emotions?
Okay, so yeah, Spain. I haven't traveled a lot abroad, but I've been to Spain a couple times. And the first time I went to Spain was like, we would be out, the food, sometimes anytime you go to a different country, the food is kind of where it's at, like what you want to do, but it's also like a lot of times it's on a very different schedule than we're accustomed to here in the States, right? So um yeah, you'd go into these restaurants. And the funny thing is, I don't even know, I mean, this is probably, gosh, at least 15 years ago now that first time I went to Spain. But we were guided by a friend of ours, and we would go out and we'd just go, and it was so great because you'd show up and you're hungry, but you just order a drink and then they bring you whatever the tapa kind of was, like the sort of hors d'oeuvre. And so it was all these funny, things that I would never order, but everything was delicious and kind of this surprise. And this little plate would come on top of your drink. So you're drinking, but also just, they're keeping you somewhat sober with the food, right? And so that was kind of this amazing, that nurture, like being taken care of and nurtured, and just celebratory, and kind of in a way communion with friends. And it was just a lovely experience, and something that has stayed with me for a very long time. It's also, tapas are one of the things my mother is always like looking at my books and like, oh, what's this project? What's this? She's like, I can't tell what this is. Like every time I was like, Mom, they're just little plates. She's like, I don't understand what this tapas is. I was like, it's just a little plate, Mom, for snacks. She's like, but I don't understand, what is this tapa? I was like, okay. I was like, okay, Mom, never mind. Just don't worry about it. It's like I said, she's like, I was like, the scoops are another thing. She was like, what is that thing in the sugar? I was like, it's a scoop. It's like a spoon. I was like, no, it's a scoop. She's like, well, what do you use it for? I was like, it's in sugar. Like, you're just using a scoop, Mom. Like, what is? She's just like, okay, whatever.
Oh, that's awesome.
Mom. She's a litmus test for some of these things where I'm just like, okay, it's not clear enough. We need to. I was talking to the photographer. I was like, okay, we got to make it more clear because my mom can't quite grasp what the hell we're doing.
Well, I can say, as someone who's done a book as well, that it is so hard to describe in words what's in a picture, and then also to do it the other way, to take a picture that describes the words you've already written. So I like that in this book, you are descriptive in the imagery, but not too descriptive. So at one point, I think on the butter dish, you have like a little handle that's put on there. But instead of showing the finished pot with two handles, you just have your hand with the handle against the pot, which makes it seem like it's an option. You can do it, but you don't have to do it. So I think the open-endedness of some of the projects is important. But I wanted to go back to this idea that you can put emotion, like trying to capture the emotion of eating in communion with friends. Like, how do you put that into an object? Because that's something, as potters, I think we're really into this.
We are really into it, and it's really difficult to do. I think that's the thing too, because most of my work is not narrative in any way. I sometimes think we can jump over that problem with narrative work. But for me, it's always been kind of this challenge to how do you make an emotional plate, right? And when you say it like that, it's like, it's impossible, but it's that idea of, like, for me, it's about form, it's about color, it's about shape. Like even like the soft, like if it's like machine made or like tooled in some fashion or touched a lot or whatever, that kind of thing. There's all these different aspects in which we can kind of in a way put ourselves into it. And I always I've kind of come to the kind of like that idea in yoga where you like set an intention, right? We're just going to set an intention. Sorry, I'm saying that funny, an intention. Anyways, that's kind of like what I try to do with the concept of putting emotion into a pot, right? Because like the idea is like I'm putting emotion and work and all of this labor into an object. Does the viewer experience that? Is that important to the viewer, or is it more important to me? Because I think there's also like value in, well, it's important to me and I'm going to do it regardless. And if a viewer gleans a little bit of that care and joy and experience, great. If not, that's okay too. But the idea is, I think through practice, we get better at doing that, right? And setting that intention where, like for me, a lot of times the word grace is on the wall, or joy, or I think about like wanderlust, like that idea of what do I do to capture that, right? I often tell this like in workshops, like if I'm developing a new object and it kind of makes me giggle and laugh, I'm on the right track, right? I'm like, oh, this is it's like, because I think of like, because I used to make an object, or have made an object called a trasket, which is like the basket and a tray that had a baby. So it's a trasket, right? And it's like that idea of like, I have this image of like I think of Perry Haas. I think of Perry carrying the basket to a workshop, or not to a workshop, to like a potluck. And I just think like it made me giggle to think of like that object in use, and it sticks with me. And so that's the thing of like, I think I talk about it in the book a little bit, is that I want to make from a place of joy. I don't make from a place of sorrow or sadness or struggle. Like that is not when I'm most creative. And so I want there to be this energy and spirit in my pots that reflects how I'm trying to live. And I think that sometimes is about identity, because I think it's a funny thing of trying to develop content for our work. I think in the beginning we look at a big piece, a whole pie. We think, okay, I want to talk about like the environment. That's really important to me. And it's like, well, that's a really big subject. And how do we narrow that down? Because really you can only maybe do a little tiny slice of that pie, and really to actually communicate with your audience, that's your intention, right? I think communication to me is also part of that, of like being an effective communicator. It takes a lot of practice, being good at speaking, or even like in our context here of like being able to make a pot that makes someone feel something, anything, that's a challenge. And I think it's like, to me, it's like funny because we say it seems kind of maybe a little haughty, a little like high art kind of talk, but I think it's about, fundamentally connecting with ourselves, knowing who I am, what I want to say, how I want, because I think, a lot of, especially why I make functional pots, I want to contribute to people's lives in some positive fashion. And it's kind of like, it doesn't have to be huge, look at me, I'm amazing. It has to be like, well, I'm comfortable. I help keep you warm in the morning with a cup of coffee, whatever that sort of small thing is like. And so I think I always am pairing it back to kind of core fundamental feelings, and I think, and that journey has to be good for the culture of this day. We all have to like get in touch with like how we're feeling. So I think we have a lot of different things going on in the world. And so I think it is nice to be able to, okay, what energy do I want to put forth? And so if I can whittle that down into a more core emotion that speaks to the foundation of our human experience, is important to me. So and I think that's the thing. It's like, it doesn't happen overnight. You sometimes don't even, I think you sometimes don't even know how you arrive, but you kind of have to start thinking about it. And then you get closer and closer step by step. And then, when you've sort of strayed away, we're like, oh, that doesn't quite feel right, and I need to move back this direction. But that's that like self-awareness. We just have to be, like we're talking about, it's like mindfully making, basically, right? We have to turn off the self-talk, but in a way that it's more, it's like not that chatter of like, I'm great, I'm awesome, or I'm shit, and I'm horrible. It's more of asking ourselves questions of like, oh, is this what I want? Oh yeah. Like it's making these sort of critical choices in development of also our hand skills and our choices there. I think that's a really interesting like way to approach making in any kind of medium, really.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Scut is a proud sponsor of the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. Scut Ceramic Products has been in manufacturing equipment for potters since 1953. Their reputation as a pioneer in innovative kiln design continues with the fourth generation of this family-owned business. Their Kiln Master touchscreen controller offers a sleek, smartphone-like interface that is both intuitive and packed with powerful tools that allow potters to easily program, diagnose, and remotely monitor their kilns. With 5 dedicated kiln technicians on staff and the most comprehensive network of distributors across the globe, you can be assured that Scut will be there for you before and after the sale. For more information on their line of kilns, visit scut.com. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. But I wanted to transition and talk about mental health. This is something that you and I have talked about for years, while we would work out together, sweating in the gym. It's funny, we would be doing whatever we would be doing. We'd be doing lunges, but we'd be talking about dealing with self-doubt or all these things. So can you talk about how you recognized a need in yourself to slow down? Because in the book you mentioned that, I'm making pots that help people slow down. But I think you as the maker, if you can't recognize your own need that hey, I'm getting towards a crisis here, I gotta do something, then it really is all for naught. So can you talk about being able to recognize that?
So I think I've had a couple different turning points in my career, and that has translated into my practice a lot, because the reality is where we spend our time is where we spend our life. And I spend my time in the studio or teaching. And I've had a couple things that have happened. It's interesting because I feel like I had I would say, time management health crisis, basically, where I was working way too much. I wasn't taking care of myself. I realized I was really sad and this was pre-pandemic. This was back in, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe. But I basically was teaching a lot of workshops, almost 20 or more a year. I was working, when I was in the studio, 10 to 12 hours a day. I was really unhealthy. And I kind of realized, and I wanted to quit. I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. I hate my life. And when you go, I hate my life, and you realize also your position is enviable, that people would like to be where you're at, it really, I think, shifts. And I kind of heard a good quote around that time that was, instead of saying that I don't have time for something, say it's not a priority. And what I realized was that I was not prioritizing myself, my physical self, my well-being. And when you say, I'm not a priority, holy shit, how is it? That really, I think for me, it struck me deeply. And it's sort of when I started working out, when I said, okay, I work 8 hours and then I'm home before 9 every night. Because I think when that crisis hit, I also had a whole nother year planned exactly the same. So for me, it was, I have to change myself and how I'm taking care of myself. And at that moment, the pendulum hasn't really swung back. I'm okay, if nothing happens, because I don't know that I say this directly in the book, but I've said it before in kind of an article, is that you asked, what's your most important tool or your favorite tool in the studio? And what I realized was that if I don't show up, nothing happens, right? I'm the most important tool. And so, and that's the truth. It's if I don't show up, and if even the readers, folks, if you don't show up, then nothing happens. And so however we choose to take care of ourselves is going to impact that. And I, Sandy Simon has been a wonderful influence in that way, where I remember her telling me once, sometimes the most important time you spend is not in the studio, it's outside the studio. It's how you refresh yourself, how you feed your soul and your mind and all of the energy that is going to come out in that studio space. And so that really for me was a journey toward, because I think I had thought that working harder, that was where I think that's that thing. I think I got caught up maybe. I mean, it was in grad school. Like nobody ever said take a fucking walk. Nobody said like, oh, you should do this, and I, because all I really wanted to do was figure out how to do this ceramic thing. Um and I didn't, it like my personal well-being and health didn't sort of matter in that equation. And so anyway, so from there, like that kind of has gotten me into this journey. And I think with um like 2020 happened, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, is that I think we all have had our own crises in that sort of realm, right? We had being locked down, we've had Black Lives Matter, like a lot of social justice stuff come up, like a lot of things that really challenged. Like I like to talk to people about this, where the reality is we lost all thought semblance that we've had control over our lives, right? We were really challenged in lots of ways, and that for me, resulted also in another sort of mental health crisis. I had, like, having been challenged for safety and like different things, like I really struggled with a few things and got into therapy and had some resources luckily to do that. But I think that's the thing I always wish I had had in my ceramics education, the idea that you're important, that your well-being is important. And while I know my teachers cared for me and all of that stuff, it wasn't taught. It wasn't said, hey, this is really important to figure out, like, because I think physically, I've gotten myself into dangerous situations with like wood firing, different places where I was really like, no one said, hey, don't scrub shelves for 12 hours straight. Like, okay, so that I really damaged myself. Um, and I think that's another thing, like 2020 sort of taught me, and I don't know if it's for good or bad, but that there's no one really that's going to take care of you but you, and that's just the truth of it. And um, in lots of ways, I mean, I think that to me is really important, especially for trying to initiate people into the ceramics world, is that we have problems. We have lots of problems in our ceramic culture. And how important it is to listen to yourself, how important it is to advocate for yourself, um, because I think we also live in discomfort. We're used to the idea that, well, it's uncomfortable to sit at a wheel, so I'm just going to be uncomfortable. And we don't say, oh, well, I'm uncomfortable, and maybe that's my body saying, don't do this. You need to figure out some different way to do this, right? And so I think I luckily have been gifted with that. Like, my mom was a physical therapist. I was in massage therapy, or like I did massage therapy for a while. Like I'm more connected and in my body in some fashion to be like, oh, I'm just going to change and figure out how to be comfortable, because that's a better place to work from. Where I've sat next to people that are like, oh, I've never thought to do that, and I just go home with a limp, and you're like, okay, that's not good, right? Like, so I think there is, like, for me, it's been a big part to acknowledge that we have certain areas in ceramics that we need to grow, but also because I think that's the thing too. Like, you and I have been gifted with the information of traveling to hundreds of different ceramic studios. Like, I've been all over this country in all these different ceramic spaces, and they're all kind of similar, and they don't necessarily take physical comfort into any kind of consideration. And then there's also, you add the social justice stuff in, and they're predominantly white spaces. Like, we look at, and so I think, and while I know a lot of people, I don't know, folks don't want to sort of hear that in the ceramics community sometimes. I think it's really important to look at and try to make those spaces more welcoming to people, because if you're going to fancy yourself an inclusive community, and the ceramics community really does think of themselves as very inclusive and friendly, and sharing, like they have these sort of signposts they put up that sort of signal their their goodness in some fashion, then we really need to work harder towards that. And, and I also think, um, I briefly mentioned it in the book about like how to make sure that you're to visit spaces, look, see if it is a space for you, talk to people, but also that, hey, you can work at your kitchen table until you find that space, because I think no one should be denied the ability to kind of have a creative space and creative outlet just based on some random building that has equipment, So I don't know. So I think there's a lot that goes into the mental health question, because I think so much of that really got we just really have a long way to go to work towards that. And I think we can look at a creative practice as not necessarily essential to our well-being, but it definitely can be a little piece of the pie, and it can be an important piece of the pie. And also, like, I think it can be connective to like our past and moving forward, how we choose to communicate and care for it. I mean, I talk about like that idea of like, how do we set aside time for ourselves? Like, how do we get our family to accept that I'm at the kitchen table working with the clay? It's not the time I'm going to get you a glass of water. Like, how do you make that time for yourself? And that is actually really honoring a commitment to yourself in some fashion. So yeah, so I think mental health to me like comes through like it's every aspect of our life, really trying to find some avenue that, because I think it's also like what's beautiful about clay and working with clay is like it can I've always sort of said this, and that like for me clay was the first time I actually understood mindfulness, that idea of being present in a moment, because I couldn't focus on anything else but centering the clay on the wheel like that. Like, like no other thoughts distracted me. Now all the thoughts distract me. But it's like in the beginning, you can really find that mindfulness and that kind of focus. And to then, like, as you move through, you get less and less kind of focus maybe, but you can still come back, figure out how to come back to that moment. It's a good place for that, I think, anyways.
I love this. There's one page in the book where the sidebar on the right side is where you talk about like finding a place you're comfortable. And you mentioned some of the, larger social ills that inevitably come into the studio. So the isms, racism, sexism, ableism, elitism, we're not, as people, we bring that stuff to everywhere we go. So of course they're going to be in clay centers. But then you also put into words something I've never thought about, which is that our community is based on the idea that you need to pay your dues, and how that can create an extremely toxic environment, because there's just so many things that can be wrong with that. Like you've mentioned, even just scraping shelves for 12 hours because so-and-so told you to do that. Like that, in a way, you're building character, but also you're wrecking your elbows and your eyes and your whatever. So I think I'm just interested in the larger conversation. Like, when is the paying the dues actually building character, and when is it an imbalance of power? And how do we tell?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I mean, I think that's what's interesting is that when you're young and eager, you're kind of willing to do whatever. And what I've heard over the last few years, especially, come out is that power dynamic that has been mistreated, and that it is about power, and it's not about actually ceramics education. It's not about, a lot of those scenarios, it has allowed for abuse to occur. And I think and the thing is, having been someone that has come up and been broke and been at a residency and been trying to like figure out how to survive and continue down this path, I have been put into some very disturbing situations that were unsafe, situations that made me extremely vulnerable. And I think it's led me down a path to try to advocate for those scenarios to not exist anymore, because they have no place in a professional world. And I want ceramics. I mean, to me, it's about elevating ceramics to a professional level, and that professional spaces don't take advantage of young people, or they don't take advantage or don't create power dynamic where people can be abused, right? We would hope. We say that with hope. But yeah, I think that's what's interesting is how we set up our internships or apprenticeships or assistantships, whatever all those ships are, within ceramics, it's really hard to, I think, police those in any kind of way, because we are very small institutions. We're just like, I'm a one person operation, right? So I have, like, recently I hired someone to be an assistant. It's like, I'm just one person. I pay this person a wage that I think is fair, that they've agreed to, but we know it's like, how do you set up a dynamic where, like, say you're trading space for work instead of money for work, right? There has to be really clear guidelines about what those jobs are, what the time access is. All of that sort of stuff has to be really laid out. And I think with the idea of protecting all the parties included. And I think, because I think that it's interesting. I do feel like younger people have a little bit more of a voice to say, I'm not interested in doing that. And rightfully so. It's like, I don't think they should necessarily have to do that stuff anymore. So it is funny to, like, I don't know. It's like, I wonder about that too, because I do think there is like some things to be learned through labor. I do believe that. But it is like, anytime I've had an assistant or something, it's always surprising to them that a big part of my job is like cleaning the studio, cleaning the bathroom, and answering emails, and like all of the menial stuff is not the beauty of like throwing a pot on the wheel. Like, it's not that, right? And so it's the job part of this business that is less appealing, and often like what I will pay someone to do, because it's more important for me to make pots than to clean the bathroom, to get ready for a studio sale or something like that, right? So, but it's like, for me, I'm always thinking, but I think that's the weird thing, is like, I think sometimes the older generation of makers, they, I don't know, I think back to this one workshop I gave, and it was up in Canada, and I was sharing the stage with someone. And this person was relaying a story about working with or being a student of Ken Ferguson, and was kind of regaling and recounting the abuse they received under that person, right? But they were telling it in this way to get like oohs and ahs from the crowd, and like, oh, just kind of like, there was a bit of this kind of I bore the weight of that abuse, and I've risen above it. And I'm sitting on the stage with this person sharing that space, and I was like, I'm glad you survived that situation, but that situation should have never happened. An art professor, a person hired by an educational institution, should not abuse students. And the room was silent. I was just like, boom. I was just like, because I think that was the thing where I'm like, yeah, we can recount like our hardships, but maybe we should really work to not celebrate those. Those hardships should not exist for the people that are coming behind us, right? And we should work to create better spaces, and that and that's, to me, is about like, you have to talk about it. Because I think they're also difficult situations, because I mean, you and I have talked a lot about family history, and I had a very abusive father, and that those things where I've learned to deal with obnoxious men. I know how to handle dirty old men. That's sort of, the reality is like, it doesn't mean that just because I can handle someone like that, that the person standing next to me should have to deal with that same person, right? There should be consequences for the dirty old man in the scenario to be out of the picture, right? And I've had to own my own contribution to that, of like, okay, well, this is how you handle that person, instead of going to the powers that be that say, hey, we need to figure out how to eliminate this scenario from happening in our spaces, because not everybody is equipped to deal with things in the same way, or has the same toolbox, right? We all have a different toolbox with how we deal with situations that make us uncomfortable. And I think that's the thing too, of like having space and having those conversations to allow for other people's experiences, because I think that's, one of the things that I think for women particularly, speaking for myself and other women I've spoken to about this, is that sometimes people freeze. They don't know how to handle a situation. Um, and that's okay. The reality is like, you have to be, it's like, okay, well, you shouldn't have to necessarily um, know how to handle a situation where your workshop instructor shows up naked to class. That's not something that they tell you in a rule book how to handle that scenario, right? Like, Jesus effing Christ, right? That is not what I signed up for in this workshop, but apparently it happened. And so, you're dealing with unknown circumstances and triggering situations. And the truth is, we don't, and you want to get along. We all kind of want to get along and figure out how to do stuff. And so I think to me, it's just like, we have to talk about it and we have to acknowledge it and we have to try and um, fumble through, try to be better, try to listen. Right. I mean, I think that's a big part of all of this, is listening to people, and also maybe saying we don't have the answers. I think that's the thing too, of like, uh, everyone's experience is so different. And I think it's also just like, we're all part of the problem. We're all, I think that's, another thing to recognize, like, we're all contributing and we've all learned to live a certain way. And it takes a lot of work to look at the way we were brought up, the way we live our life, and say, oh, am I impacting people negatively? Is this not okay? Like, to own that is really hard. But it's also, I think, it's part of the world we're living in right now, is to try to grow and be more thoughtful. I think is a good way to look at it, to look and see and understand that things we've done in the past were not great, or damaging to people. I think, because I also just want, like, I think, for me, the message in the book of like, if you find that's kind of those mentality, that pay your dues mentality is alive and well in the place, maybe don't participate in that place. Because because of what I've heard over time and in my own experience, is that it's really not worth it. It's just not, it actually, you're not going to get what you think you want from that situation, even if you do pay your dues, right? Because if this scenario is about the power dynamic and this one person, then that's what it's always going to be about. They're never going to give you a status change, or no one person can elevate your career in any fashion, especially in ceramics of all places. Like, no one person has the power to make or break your career, right? It's just like you, and there's just a lot of different experiences that you can have in this ceramic world, and really they should be positive. Mostly, I mean, we all have the heartbreak of opening the kiln and nothing being right. That's enough heartbreak. That's the only heartbreak you should basically have, right? But it's like, because I think that's what's crazy, is like, you go through these studio spaces, all across the country, right? There's always that one person. There's always that one person that's just the thorn in people's side, that just takes up too much space, or just, their way or the highway, even though they're just a community member like you. Like, I think that's what's so crazy, is that I think every, probably, any kind of community space always has someone like that. And it is trying to navigate and look at how to, I don't know, handle that person, or create an institution where that person is not welcome, or whatever that sort of scenario is. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's not uncommon, unfortunately.
Well, one of the things that you say in the book, which I think just needs to be said like 1,000 times, is trust your gut. Like, if you're in a space and you don't feel comfortable, there's other spaces, and that's okay. Like, whatever your nervous system is telling you, whether it's fight, flee, freeze, any of those things, or stay, like, listen to that. Like, we have evolved as humans to recognize comfortability and, on the other hand, danger. So
Right.
trust your gut.
Trust your gut. I think, and that's that thing of like, I mean, lately I've been looking at houses, and it's the same in a weird way. You walk in, you're like, yeah, no. Like, my body just knows immediately, like, if I can make the space happen or not. And I think it's the same with any kind of like interaction. You just have to And that's why I think it's like, don't leap, don't make such a quick decision. Just give it a second, take a breath. And then, because I think we don't have to make a decision in the presence of those people. We can say, I'm just going to think about it. And then like analyze what happened to you in that scenario, right? Feel like, know what your body was telling you and connect. Cause I think that's the other thing too. If people are coming to ceramics, they have kind of, any type of art scenario, people have this energy, and there's and that we were talking about earlier, like vulnerability. You need to feel safe in a space to be your best creative self. So make sure that place is safe for you, and because it's like, I think that's what I've heard so many times too, is that allowing that one person to take up so much space that they diminish everyone else's experience. It's really tragic, and it's really unfortunate that one person is allowed to do that, because it's like, it's not necessary. So yeah, trust your gut, trust your body.
Well, how can people pre-order the book? Because it's coming out in September or August?
September 6th is the release date. Pre-orders are available now. They're available kind of anywhere you buy books. So if people are listening internationally, just check your international sources. I have links on my website, so sunshinecobb.com. There's a new book page, and so there's like 5 or 6 different links. You can also pre-order from me. If you pre-order anywhere, I am offering a free workshop after the book comes out, so you can have the book in hand, and I'll teach a couple of projects from the book in a workshop. You just have to sign up on my website and for a proof of purchase type of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much, it's out there. It's in the world. So.
And tell me the name of the book again.
It is The Beginner's Guide to Hand Building. I think it's sculptural and functional.
Yeah, they always have a little subtitle.
They have a little blurb, right? Yeah, yes.
But The Beginner's Guide to Hand Building, that people will be able to find it.
Beginner's Guide to Hand Building, yeah. I know, I kind of wanted to write something about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, like a comparison, but yeah, my editor was like, no, we don't need to go there. Yeah, I was like, yeah, but it has a whole galaxy. So,
yeah, shout out to Tom O'Hearn, who has done so much for all of us to make us sound like we know what we're doing.
I know. He's great. Yeah, this book wouldn't have happened without him. I don't know. We talked about something, and it was like, he put the seed, and I was like, maybe. Because I think after the first book, I was like, I'm never writing another book again. It was just so much trouble. And so it was interesting to come back a few years later and just be like, oh no, I really want to do this. My mother was like so shocked. She's like, really? You're going to do this again? I was like, yeah, I'm going to. She's like, oh God, here we go. Even though she loves to tell people that her daughter's written a book or two. So,
well, congrats. It came out great, and thanks for taking the time to do this today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. I appreciate it.
I'd like to thank Sunshine for coming on the show. It was nice to hear about the new book, as well as her take on mental health. This is a topic that I think a lot about and have put a lot of effort in my own life to make sure that I'm staying balanced mentally as well as physically. And we're actually going to have a whole series on that coming up in May for Mental Health Awareness Month. So look forward to that in about the middle of May or so. Also wanted to take a minute and thank our sponsors. We are sponsored by Bailey Ceramic Supply, Amico Brent, and Scut Ceramic Products. If you'd like to become a sponsor of the podcast, you can do that by getting in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the First People of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.